So our next speaker, Arjun Srinivasan.
That's as good as I can do.
That was
Yeah.
as you do. Okay, very good. So his first job in data visualization was to develop a sports dashboard for a challenge organized by SAP in India. Good. And his last job, he hopes, will be in research in an industry lab or with a few teaching gigs on the side. So very good, Arjun. It's yours.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Arjun Srinivasan. I'm a second year PhD student at Georgia Tech, and this is work done in collaboration with Matthew Bremer, who's back there, Bongxing Lee, and Stephen Drucker at Microsoft Research. Let's set up the context a little bit with an example. Can you all raise your hands if you've seen a dashboard like this one that shows sales or some sort of values for a given year? All right, that's almost 90% or 100% of the room. So I'm sure many of us have seen these kind of dashboards. And for instance, this one over here shows carbon dioxide production levels for a given year, in this case 2015. Now let's just focus on this chart that shows us monthly values. So looking at this, we can observe a bunch of things about the data. So we can see things like July and December had the lowest values. There was a bit of a decline between January and February. Other months had some pretty high values and so on. But one problem with this is that we don't know what these values mean. Like, is there a context to this? For instance, we know that July and December had low values, but is this something specific to 2015 or was this something consistent across the years? Alternatively, if I toggle between 2014 and 2015 values, you can see that July has risen by a huge amount, whereas some other months like September and October have dropped by a huge amount. Yep, I said. Oh, no, the other way around. The July month has dropped and September and October have risen by huge amounts. So as illustrated by this example, unfortunately, most dashboards today or many visualizations in dashboards today don't provide such context that might be critical when you're looking at a visualization. So as part of our work, we explored various visualization designs that can help highlight such differences in the context of dashboards. We specifically looked at bar charts because they're probably the most common way to show data and or commonly used visualizations in dashboards today. Now, as is often done in research, before we sort of set out designing solutions to validate how important the problem was, we conducted some interviews with dashboard experts in the form of product managers of Microsoft Power BI. And we also looked at publicly created dashboards in both Power BI and Tableau. We observed three main variants of comparative visualizations these dashboards have to offer today. So the first ones were cases like these, where the series that were being compared were juxtaposed or put side by side. So on the left, you have values for 2014, followed by on the right, you have values for 2015. A related design was one where this juxtaposition or grouping was based on categories, and this was shown using a more classic grouped bar chart. There's obviously some good things about these designs, right? So, for example, they show the original or the raw values, so you can still look at a dashboard and get the context of what the current values are, which is good because you want that you're just glancing at a dashboard, you get the right values, and you can move forward if that's all your goal is. Another good thing is that they preserve the space on the dashboard, so that chart would take the same amount, the bars would just compress, and they would still remain a bar chart, so it's not like you have to learn a new visualization just to understand what the change is. But these visualizations do have some issues when it comes to comparison in particular. So they can be misleading when the data categories are varying. For instance, in this chart, if one of the products was missing a value in a previous year or just did not exist, this chart would show it as having a value of 0, which is false. And you can see this happen in multiple examples. So product 2, 6, 7, and 13, they look like they just have a value of 0 for the previous year, but in fact, these products just did not exist. So instead of saying that it was a missing value or did not exist, it shows it as having a value of 0. Secondly, unless you sort of have numeric labels like you have in the example on the top, it can get pretty difficult to understand or measure what the difference is because you have to first perceive what the value is and then do the calculation mentally. Another type of visualization that we saw in dashboards which were currently used were these sort of charts that directly showed the computed difference. So in this case, the chart is showing changes in policy growth values between 2 years as a percentage. These designs are great when it comes to highlighting or allowing users to measure the differences directly, but they have some other limitations. So since they don't show the raw or actual values, they typically need to be used with other visualizations that actually show the raw values. And this leads to wastage of space on the dashboard. Furthermore, for some things like the earlier example of dynamic data categories where they come and go between years, this kind of a chart is never going to be able to tell you what categories are new to this year or were specific to the previous year. even with these kind of limitations, we surprisingly found these to be one of the most common ways to show data on dashboards today. Given some of these limitations with these existing designs individually, we sort of wanted to see, is there a design space that combines the good things about all of these and sort of still shows all the good things that this one can do and all the good things that that chart can do, and come up with a new design space. So given our findings from these interviews and the surveys of dashboards that we conducted, we set out to explore other possible design variations. We implemented an interactive interface that allowed us to configure and compare different charts that facilitated comparison. So we varied properties like color, sorting order and mark type, and different design strategies. Now, since this essentially rendered a bunch of bar charts, we called it the bartender. And there's some more bar jokes coming on, so if you want to grab some beer, you should. In terms of the designs that we considered, we looked at some what we call juxtaposition-based designs. So these involve side by side. So on the top you have a series 1, series 2. On this one you sort of have series combined into a single chart. We also looked at some explicit encoding or derived value-based designs. So things which directly compute the differences and visualize that. And some superimposition-based designs that sort of take the values for one series and put it on top of another. In addition to looking at variations sort of among a single design category, we also looked at charts that combine these strategies. So for example, this one over here combines juxtaposition, explicit encoding, and superimposition, and overlays these different lines which are shown in purple on top of this grouped bar chart. So in this case, the active series or for the year 2016 is shown as a blue bar, whereas the previous year or 2015 is shown as orange, and the purple lines represent what the difference is between the two. If you notice, there's a slight offset, and that's to show that it's sort of a derived value as opposed to the raw series value itself. Similarly, this other example combines explicit encoding and superimposition. You can see the active values as shown as blue bars, and the differences compared to the previous year shown as purple lines. Now, once the bartender served us over 20 design alternatives, we distilled or picked out 4 of these to study them further. And those jokes were not written by me, so please. 2 of these were again baseline visualizations that we saw earlier. So you have the grouped bar chart and a variation of what we saw in the difference chart. And this was done, as I'll just talk about, just to maintain consistency in terms of what the experiment was. And the other 2 designs that we compared these 2 against were superimposition or overlay based alternatives of these, which showed both the raw values and the differences. So to test if these charts actually were usable and people preferred them and they could potentially even be used to substitute these existing designs, we then conducted a user study. We conducted an online experiment with 74 participants, testing their performance for these 4 visualizations across 6 tasks and 2 data conditions. I'm not going to get into too much of detail about this, but just to give a sense of what participants were looking at, here's an example of a task. So in this case, the participant is shown monthly values for 2002 and 2003 and is asked to enter the change in value between the 2 years for the month of June. So they look at the chart, they just go ahead and they enter in a value. We did this for each visualization type. Participants were provided with an introduction to the visualization itself, some example data sets, and they were allowed to test out a few tasks so that they can get familiarized with the experimental setup and the visualization. And then they performed a set of training or testing trials. And for each trial, we recorded the amount of time it takes for them to compute the answer, how far off or how correct they were. And we also recorded subjective preferences in which they could tell us which chart they liked most or least and why. In terms of the results, at a high level, we found that when it came to tasks that involved finding the extreme values in the active series or tasks involving sort of series-specific categories, these hybrid designs, or the ones on the right, performed comparably to this baseline visualization which is used in dashboards today. But specifically when it came to difference-based tasks, these designs performed much better than this one. These hybrid designs also performed comparably when it came to these difference-based tasks against that other baseline visualization, which is suited specifically for that category of tasks. In terms of subjective preferences, we found that most people preferred this visualization, and it was about 85% of the people saying that this is the visualization they like the most. And on the other hand, the difference chart was the one that people said that they liked the least. And this was surprising given that this was one of the most common designs that we saw used in dashboards today. So such findings, along with the fact that the combined hybrid visualizations sort of allow more tasks, highlight potential value in exploring these designs further. To just give a flavor of what kind of future work exists in the space, I'm going to show a quick example of what can be done with these hybrid sort of designs. So one potential application is in narrative visualizations. So these visualizations typically use animation as a technique to sort of reveal changes over time. But depending on how much you're animating, it can get pretty difficult to keep track of what's happening. So these difference overlays can kind of be used to smoothly reveal what the change is. And this can in turn help people to sort of keep track of the changes and better follow the narrative. To summarize, we found that people really want to look at differences on data and dashboards, and they often want to do so without explicitly interacting with the visualization or the dashboard itself. And we looked at some designs which can allow people to perform such visual comparison, and we found that these can exhibit not only comparable performance in terms of tasks, but also they were subjectively preferred. On that note, I hear the beeper. I thank you all for your time, and I'm now ready to take your questions.
On a des questions pour Arjun? Je suis sûr que tout le monde ici fait des podcasts.
Oui. Yeah. Okay. So I'm trying to figure out. So you have the goal, right? Your goal here is to figure out the differences, right?
Yes, one of them.
Have you kind of researched or looked at trying to find by exceptions and trying to be more about highlighting the exceptions? Meaning, right? The person wants to see compared to last year, which one has big difference, right? Because you don't want to see necessarily what's been the same, right? You're trying to highlight what is really a difference. What is so that's the actual goal of the user, right?
Great.
So I try to understand if you explored exceptions more based.
So unfortunately, I was just seeing if I had some of the backup slides. I don't have it over here. But we did look at that in the initial designs that we were considering. So in this interface, there are some options which, let me see if I can pause this at some point. Yeah, all right. Yeah, okay. So we did have some options over here which sort of allowed us to highlight series that were, or values that were new to a specific series. So for instance, if there are 3 categories or 2 products that are only specific to the year that you're looking at right now. So we would sort of put marks on them or highlight them specifically to show that these are new categories. So you might want to focus on these further. But again, that's formally studying that is a different study in itself, and that was beyond the scope of what we were doing now. But yes, we did consider that. And I think that also comes down to what is sort of the context in which all of this is being used. So if you're looking at, I don't know, sales or something like that, and you care about new products more than old ones, then maybe we want to put those in bold or show those kind of extra annotations. But we also have to be careful because at the end of the day, like we found initially while speaking to both the product managers and sort of users, that at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you can just look at values off a dashboard. So dashboards are also typically used sort of in ambient displays. So you don't want it to be like, oh, I take 5 minutes to just understand what's going on. You also want to be able to take a look and get the data and then just leave. So we want to make sure we strike a balance between that.
Est-ce qu'on a une dernière question pour Arjun? Tout le monde va aller lire ce que tu as.
Voici, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.